Good morning, church. Good morning. Turn your Bible to Luke 15. The title of today's sermon, we're doing a series on Jesus. Last week was a very quiet audience. I preached on Jesus and women. Some men sat forward and some men sat back, and all the women sat forward attentively and clapped me on the back at the end of the sermon and went, "Good job, Joe." Today, I don't know if you're going to feel the same way. Today's sermon is on Jesus versus religion. You know, as we share our faith and we study the Bible with people, a lot of people go, "I don't believe in organised religion. The church this, the church that." Well, I'll tell you, Jesus had a real problem with the church of his day. Jesus didn't like organised religion of his day. So when people say that, I normally go, "Me too." And Jesus didn't like it either. And they're sort of taken aback and they're like, "Well, now what do I say?" You know, the New Testament, there's a definite portrait of Jesus having a really tense relationship with the religious leaders of his day. And they were called the Pharisees. You know, there was this time when they just seemed to disagree on everything. There just was nothing that they could have unity on. The truth of it is, the Pharisees and Jesus simply disagreed on what it meant to be holy. Jesus said, "Your view of what it means to be holy before God, I just don't agree with. You're absolutely wrong." And Jesus did not hold back on laying out the religious. To the weak he was kind. To the widows he was generous. To the tax collector who said, "I'm a sinner," he goes, "No problem, we'll work with you." But to the religious, he absolutely laid them out. Most of us in here consider ourselves to be religious. Today we must ask ourselves, are we more like Jesus or more like the religious people in the Bible? Not only must we ask that about ourselves, but we need to ask ourselves that of the religious people in our lives that we look up to and try and imitate. Because if you are trying to imitate a false religious person or a Pharisaical person, you will become that person. So we're going to take a look at the difference between being religious, a Pharisee, and being Christ-like. I have 4 points today. The first point is simply this: the problem the Pharisees had with Jesus. I mean, what was their problem? I mean, Jesus was a good guy, right? He was the Son of God. What was the problem? You know, they were very, very critical of the people that Jesus hung out with. They didn't like his friends. They went, "It's not right that you hang out with tax collectors and sinners. You're just not meant to do that when you're religious." In Luke 15, verse 1, it says, "Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear him." That's Jesus. "But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, 'This man welcomes sinners and eats with them.'" They were like, "You've got to understand, Jesus, if you're meant to be holy, you should be hanging around other holy people. But you seem to be hanging around with tax collectors." That's like politicians of our day. Ooh, New South Wales politicians, those people that are hypocrites, you know, or prostitutes or drunkards, or what are you doing with them? You're meant to be holy. And then if you turn to John 9, the other thing they had a real problem with Jesus was he just did not observe the Sabbath the way they said he should. They were like, on Sabbath, you're meant to go to the synagogue. You're only meant to walk a certain amount of distance to the synagogue, and you're meant to do nothing. It should be a time where you just sit and worship God. If you were a good Jew, that's what you should do. And in John 9, verse 13, it says, "They brought to the Pharisees the man who had been blind. Now the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was the Sabbath. Therefore the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. 'He put mud on my eyes,' the man replied, 'and I washed, and now I see.' Some of the Pharisees said, 'This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath.' But others said, how can a sinner do miraculous signs?" So they were divided. The religious were so blind. Here's this guy's been blind. There's a man called Jesus who heals him. He sees. And what are they focused on? Oh, he did it on a Sabbath. They missed out. This guy can see now. It's unbelievable. And what are they focusing on? Yeah, but he did it on the Sabbath. Who cares whether he did it on a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday? This guy sees. And they totally missed it. They were so wrapped up in their own way that God wanted religion, they couldn't see the true heart of God. They could not get their minds around Jesus' form of holiness. Can we? Comes the question. The other thing that the Pharisees really tried to enforce on people is they really believed that the righteousness of the nation was important. They believed that they could be holy by making all of Israel holy. And so they put in loads of rules. They told them that they should follow the Torah, which was the first 5 books. And then they wrote all of these different books, all of these different commentaries on the Torah. And they said you must obey those too. Because let's be honest, if you read the Torah, you don't really understand it. And so we as the really spiritual people will write loads of different books, and then that will help you. And you need to obey those books too, because that's the real way to interpret the scriptures. And they started to elevate their view of God's teaching almost to the point of more than the teaching itself. You know, it is great that we have lots of commentaries and Google and the internet and everything, but when people start quoting, well, Martin Luther said this, well, the Pope said this, well, my pastor said this, what are we really got to say? I don't care what they say. What does Jesus say? What does God say? That's the only person I'm really, really interested in. How did they respond? If you go to Matthew 12:14, you see, all of a sudden, Jesus was attacking their way of doing things, their level of importance. And how did they respond? They simply, in Matthew 12:14, it says, but the Pharisees went out and plotted how they might kill Jesus. They weren't angry. They got to the point where they went, I'm going to kill you. You don't agree with me, I'm absolutely going to kill you. It's interesting when you get into a debate with a religious person and you see them getting angrier and angrier and angrier. Maybe in the Western world today, they don't feel like they're allowed to kill you. So anger is their own event. Persecution is their own event. But it's exactly with the heart of a Pharisee. They didn't have humbled hearts. They considered him a genuine threat to their spiritual way of life, to the political welfare of the nation. And they simply didn't just persecute him, they wanted to kill him. When you are truly living like Jesus, it should not surprise you that religious people get really angry at you. Because Jesus' teachings are offensive to the religious. Are your personal beliefs offensive to the religious? Or are you popular amongst your Christian friends, your religious friends? My second point is this. So we've looked at the problem the Pharisees had with Jesus. Now let's take a look at the problem Jesus had with the Pharisees. If you turn your Bible to Matthew 5:20. Jesus considered the Pharisees' religious approach not only ineffective in establishing true righteousness, but he also felt like it was counterproductive to actually having a relationship with God. In Matthew 5:20, Jesus is very clear here. And you've got to understand the audience here. He was in Israel. The Pharisees would have been in the congregation of many of his sermons. And in Matthew 5:20 he says, for I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and teach the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. That's like me going, Jason, everybody knows Jason, or Mason, he's the singer, great. Unless you're more spiritual than him, you're in real trouble. I don't think it's going to make Mason feel. He took them on. He saw their type of religion as counterproductive